The Ninth Wave Part 1. The Summoning. Come close to the fire. Let me tell you about the ninth wave, about two sisters who never knew each other existed, and about the price the goddess demands when magic itself hangs by a thread. This is a story of blood and destiny, of choices made in darkness, and of the terrible truth that sometimes love means letting go of everything you thought you knew. The last priestess of Avalon died on the first night of spring, when the veil between worlds grows thin and restless. Her name was Vivienne, and she had carried the weight of the sacred isle alone for longer than most mortals live, watching as the mists grew thicker and fewer could find their way through. As the old ways faded like morning fog under the burning sun of the new gods' churches, she died knowing she had failed in one thing. The ritual that sustained Avalon, that kept the island anchored between the mortal world and the realm of magic, required two of her bloodline to perform. Two daughters of the same mother, standing at the threshold between worlds, their combined power weaving the spell that would renew the magic for another generation. But Vivienne had only one daughter left on Avalon. The other, the dangerous one, the one the sight had warned her about in dreams too vivid to ignore, she had given away 20 years ago to the Christians, to their greystone convents where magic was sin, and the goddess just another demon to be feared. Her name was Elaine, and she knew nothing of Avalon, nothing of her true heritage, nothing of the sister who existed somewhere beyond the world she understood. She had lived at St. Brigid's convent since she was a baby, raised by nuns who were kind in their way, who taught her to read Latin and tend the sick and keep her eyes downcast in the presence of men. She was good at obedience. She was good at silence. She was good at pretending the dreams that came to her in the darkest hours were nothing more than night terrors, random firings of a mind to long denied proper sleep, dreams of mist and standing stones. Dreams of women in robes the color of forest shadows, chanting in a language that made her bones ache with recognition. Dreams of a voice calling her name from across an impossible distance. Insistent, desperate, growing louder each night, until she woke gasping and reaching for something she couldn't name. The letter arrived on a morning when fog lay so thick across the convent grounds that the chapel bell sounded muffled and distant, as if it rang from another world entirely. Sister Meredith brought it to her in the herb garden, where Elaine spent most of her hours, her hands deep in earth, coaxing life from seeds, understanding plants in a way the other sisters found both useful and slightly unsettling. The seal on the letter was unfamiliar, a spiral pressed into dark wax that seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at it. She broke it with dirt-stained fingers and unfolded parchment that smelled of wood smoke and something green and growing. The letter was blank. She held it up to the light, turned it over, searched for words that must have faded or been written in sympathetic ink. Nothing. Just empty parchment and that strange, unsettling smell. Then, as she watched, words began to appear like smoke, condensing into form. Like thoughts becoming visible. Like magic she'd spent 20 years pretending didn't exist, finally refusing to be denied. Your mother is dead. Come to the lake at moonrise. Alone. The letter was signed with a single initial, M. Elaine stared at those words until they blurred, until her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the parchment. Your mother is dead. But her mother had died when she was born, or so the nuns had always told her. died bringing her into the world and left her on the convent steps wrapped in wool, with nothing to identify her but a name stitched in silver thread. Elaine, Starlight. She had never questioned it, had never thought to question it, had built her entire sense of self on being unwanted, abandoned, saved by the church's charity. Now this letter said otherwise, said someone knew who her mother was, said that mother had just died, said come, said alone, said moonrise, which was the language of the old ways, the forbidden ways, the magic the church spent so much effort stamping out wherever it tried to take root. She should have gone to the abbess, should have shown her the letter and asked for guidance and accepted whatever decree came down from someone wiser and older and more certain of the proper path. Instead, she found herself packing a small bag with bread and cheese, with the worn cloak that had been her mother's only gift, with hands that moved as if guided by knowledge she didn't consciously possess. The abbess found her before she could leave, standing in the doorway with an expression Elaine had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment. Something closer to resignation or perhaps relief, as if she'd been waiting 20 years for this moment and was almost glad it had finally arrived. You're going to them. Not a question. Elaine nodded because lying to the abbess had never been possible. The old woman sighed and placed something in Elaine's hands, a small cloth bag that clinked softly. Silver, enough to live on for months if she was careful. Some debts must be paid, child. Go with God, or with whoever waits for you beyond the mists. The words were both blessing and dismissal, both prayer and acknowledgement that Elaine was walking away from everything the church represented toward something older and stranger and infinitely more dangerous. The lake lay half a day's walk from the convent, through forests that grew wilder and less tamed the farther she went from cultivated lands. The path was there but barely, as if few used it anymore, as if the world had mostly forgotten this place existed. The trees grew close and strange, their branches reaching toward each other overhead until the sky disappeared and she walked through perpetual twilight. Birds called in voices she didn't recognize. The air tasted different here, sharp and clean and alive in ways that made her lungs ache. She reached the lake as the sun began its slide toward the western horizon. As shadows lengthened and the world took on that liminal quality where anything might be possible, where the boundaries between what is and what could be grow thin and permeable. The lake was perfectly still, mirror smooth, reflecting clouds and sky, so perfectly she couldn't tell where water ended and air began. The shore was rocky and wild, no sign of human habitation, no dock or boat or any indication that anyone ever came here. She stood at the edge and waited, feeling foolish, feeling frightened, feeling more alive than she had in 20 years of quiet obedience. The sun sank lower. The light turned gold, then amber, then that particular shade of blue that comes just before full dark. She wrapped her mother's cloak tighter and told herself she'd wait until moonrise, as the letter instructed. And then if nothing happened, she'd go back to the convent and confess her foolishness and accept whatever penance came. The moon rose and everything changed. One moment the lake was empty, reflecting only sky. The next, a boat materialized as if it had always been there and she'd simply failed to notice. As if reality had shifted sideways just enough to make room for something that existed in the spaces between ordinary things. The boat was simple, wooden, old in a way that suggested it had been old when the world was young. And standing at the prow with one hand resting on the carved serpent figurehead was a woman. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired and gried, wrapped in robes the color of storm clouds, standing with the kind of perfect balance that suggested she was more comfortable on water than land. She looked at Elaine across the distance, and something in her face was both familiar and completely alien, like looking into a mirror that reflected truth rather than simple appearance. "You're late." The woman's voice carried across water without effort, clear and cold and certain. "I expected you at noon." Elaine found her own voice somewhere beneath the shock and confusion. "Who are you?" The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just assessment. Just the kind of evaluation you'd give a tool you're not sure will be adequate for the task ahead. "I'm your sister Morwen, and you're coming with me whether you want to or not, because our mother died 3 days ago and Avalon is failing and we're the only ones who can save it. Now, get in the boat before the mists close and we lose our chance." Sisters. The word hung in the air like an impossibility, like a truth so large Elaine couldn't fit her mind around it. She had a sister, this woman with storm in her eyes and power radiating from her like heat from a fire. This stranger, who spoke with the authority of someone who'd never doubted herself, never questioned her place in the world, never spent 20 years learning to be small and quiet and grateful for whatever scraps of belonging were offered. The boat drifted closer to shore, moving without oars or sail, or any visible means of propulsion, responding to Morwen's will as if will alone was enough to reshape reality. Elaine stepped into it because what else could she do? Because the dreams that had haunted her suddenly made sense. Because somewhere deep in her bones, she recognized this woman, this place, this moment as the thing she'd been unconsciously moving toward her entire life. The boat rocked once, then steadied. Morwen sat and took up the oars. Though Elaine suspected the rowing was more formality than necessity, more ritual than requirement, they moved out onto the lake, and the shore behind them disappeared faster than distance alone could explain. Swallowed by mist that rose from nowhere, that moved with purpose rather than wind, that felt alive and aware and watching. The mist pressed close, and Elaine felt it brush against her skin like cold fingers, like something testing whether she was real or just another dream dissolving in morning light. She felt sick, disoriented, as if the world was tilting on an axis she couldn't perceive, as if reality was revealing itself to be far stranger and more flexible than 20 years of convent teaching had prepared her for. "Tell me what's happening." Elaine kept her voice steady through sheer force of will, through 20 years of practice at maintaining composure even when her world was shattering. "Why did our mother give me away? Why am I only learning about you now? Why do you need me?" The questions poured out, and Morwen let her finish before answering, her eyes fixed on something ahead that Elaine couldn't yet see, her hands moving on the oars with practiced rhythm. "Our mother was Vivienne, last High Priestess of Avalon. She had the sight, could see futures that hadn't happened yet, possibilities branching out like rivers finding their path to the sea. She saw something about you that frightened her, something about what you'd become if you stayed on Avalon, something dangerous enough that she gave you to the Christians when you were barely old enough to remember her face. She kept me instead, raised me to take her place, taught me everything she knew about magic and ritual, and maintaining the boundaries between worlds. She made me into exactly what Avalon needed. But it wasn't enough. What did she see? What was I going to become that was so dangerous she had to get rid of me? Morwen's jaw tightened, and for a moment something like pain flickered across her face before she locked it down behind that mask of control. I don't know. She never told me. Just said you were the dangerous one. The wild card. The one who could destroy everything if you stayed. So she sent you away and kept me. The safe one. The controllable one. The one she could shape into her successor. Except it turns out I can't do what needs doing alone. The ritual that sustains Avalon requires two of her bloodline, two daughters of the same mother. Without both of us, the magic fails. The mists will close completely. Avalon will fade from the world entirely, and everything our ancestors built, everything they died to protect, will be lost like it never existed at all. Elaine absorbed this, tried to fit these enormous truths into the small, careful worldview she'd constructed over 20 years of convent life. She had a mother who was a priestess. She had a sister raised in magic. She was needed for some ritual that would save a place she'd never heard of. The absurdity of it should have made her laugh or cry or both. Instead, she felt a strange, settling certainty, as if puzzle pieces she hadn't known were scattered were suddenly clicking into place. What happens if I refuse? What if I go back to the convent and pretend this never happened? Morwen met her eyes, and the look in them was bleak. Then Avalon dies. The old ways die. Magic fades from the world until nothing's left but the gray certainty of the Church's one true God. And you go back to your herbs and your prayers and your safe little life, wondering always what you might have been if you'd been brave enough to find out. The words were calculated to sting, to provoke, but they also carried truth. Elaine felt it in her bones, in the dreams that had called to her, in the part of herself she'd spent 20 years trying to ignore that suddenly felt awake and hungry and utterly alive. The mist parted ahead of them, and Elaine saw it. Avalon, the sacred isle that existed between worlds, that lived in the space where mortal lands ended and magic began. She saw standing stones older than memory, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at too directly, that seemed to shift when seen from the corner of her eye. She saw apple trees in full bloom, despite winter barely ended, their petals drifting like snow in a wind she couldn't feel. She saw buildings of stone and thatch, simple but beautiful, designed by people who understood that form should serve function but need not sacrifice grace. She saw torches burning with flames that flickered blue and green, and colors that had no names, that spoke of power channeled and controlled and put to use. And she saw women, perhaps a dozen, standing on the shore watching the boat approach. Old women mostly, faces lined and hands gnarled, wrapped in robes of different colors that Elaine suspected indicated rank or specialty or some distinction that meant everything here and nothing in the world she'd left behind. The boat grounded on shore, and Morwen stood with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in her body, completely certain of her place in the world. The women on shore bowed to her, a gesture of respect that spoke of established hierarchy, of authority earned or inherited or simply claimed through force of will and power. Morwen didn't acknowledge them, just gestured for Elaine to follow. She did, stepping onto ground that felt different beneath her feet, more solid somehow, more real, as if the mortal world had been a faded copy and this was the original. The women stared at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to something that might have been hope or might have been fear. She didn't look like them. Her hair was shorn close in the style the church demanded of its women, not flowing loose the way theirs did. Her clothes were rough homespun gray, not the rich dyed fabrics they wore. Her hands were calloused from work, but innocent of the ritual scars she could see marking theirs. She was other, outsider, the one who'd been sent away. Morwen led her through pathways between buildings, past gardens where herbs grew in patterns that Elaine recognized from her own work, but arranged here with additional meaning, additional purpose, as if every plant placement was also symbol and spell. They climbed stone steps worn smooth by countless feet, and entered a building that smelled of sage and beeswax and old magic. The interior was simple. A bed where someone had died recently, the linens still rumpled, the air still holding that particular quality of aftermath, of presence departed. A table covered in books and scrolls and dried flowers. A hearth cold now but marked by years of use. And on the bed, laid out with her hands folded and eyes closed, was a woman Elaine had never seen before, but recognized instantly. Her mother Vivienne. She looked smaller than Elaine had imagined, which was foolish because she'd never consciously imagined her mother at all. Had trained herself not to wonder, not to care. But seeing her now, seeing this woman who'd carried her and birthed her, and then given her away for reasons Elaine still didn't understand, she felt something crack open in her chest. Grief for someone she'd never known. Anger at being abandoned. Confusion about what she was supposed to feel. Morwen stood on the opposite side of the bed, her face carved from stone, revealing nothing. She loved you more, you know. Even though she sent you away. Even though she kept me. I could feel it in how she spoke about you. Like you were this precious thing she had to protect, even if protection meant exile. The words were bitter, carrying years of resentment, of being the daughter who stayed but was somehow less valued than the one who left. Elaine looked at her sister across their mother's body and saw the mirror image of her own pain, just twisted into a different shape. She stayed because I left. She carried the weight alone because our mother sent me away. She became what Avalon needed while I was learning to be pious and obedient and small. The unfairness of it, the casual cruelty of a mother who'd tried to protect one daughter by abandoning her and destroyed the other by keeping her close, made Elaine want to scream. Instead, she reached out and took Morwen's hand. The touch was awkward, unpracticed. The first time in her life she'd voluntarily reached for someone with affection rather than duty. Morwen flinched but didn't pull away. For a moment they stood like that, two sisters who were strangers, joined only by shared blood and the body of a woman who'd loved them in the only way she knew how, and failed them both completely. Part 2. The teaching I need to teach you. Morwen's voice was rough, tight with emotion she was fighting to control. The ritual is at Beltane, 3 days from now. You need to learn the words, the movements, what it will cost. Elaine wanted to ask what cost meant, wanted to understand what she was agreeing to, but Morwen was already moving, already pulling her toward the door, toward the work that would consume the next 3 days and leave no room for questions or doubts, or the luxury of backing out. They worked from dawn until long past dark, Morwen teaching with the intensity of someone who knows time is running out. Elaine learning with the desperate focus of someone trying to cram a lifetime of knowledge into ours. The words were an old tongue, the language from before, when humans and spirits spoke freely, and the boundaries between worlds were suggestions rather than walls. The words felt strange in Elaine's mouth at first, awkward and harsh, syllables that didn't want to sit comfortably on her Christian-trained tongue. But as she repeated them, something shifted. They began to feel familiar, like memories surfacing from deep water, like knowledge she'd always carried but forgotten how to access. The ritual structure was elegant and terrible in equal measure. It required two priestesses of the same bloodline standing at the boundary between Avalon and the mortal world. One would anchor on Avalon, channeling the power of the sacred isle, drawing on centuries of accumulated magic. On the bones of priestesses long dead who'd poured their lives into sustaining this place. The other would anchor in the mortal realm, opening themselves to that power, allowing it to flow through them like water through a channel, like lightning through a rod, becoming the conduit through which magic could move between worlds. Together they would weave a spell that renewed the connection, that kept the mists permeable, that allowed magic to flow between worlds instead of being trapped on one side or the other, instead of slowly dying from isolation and stagnation. The cost was simple and devastating. The one who anchored in the mortal world would be changed, would experience a kind of death and rebirth, would never be entirely human again but also never be entirely spirit. They would become threshold, become doorway, become the thing between things. They could never go back to what they were, could never unknow what they would learn, would spend the rest of their lives able to see both worlds simultaneously and belong completely to neither. Morwen explained this in a flat, factual tone, revealing nothing of what she thought about it, what she felt about asking this of a sister she barely knew, what it meant to her that one of them would have to make this sacrifice while the other remained safely in her familiar role. "I'll take the mortal side." Elaine said it before Morwen could assign roles, before her sister could make it an order rather than a choice, before the decision could become something imposed rather than freely given. Morwen's eyes widened, genuine surprise breaking through her carefully maintained control, the mask slipping just enough to show the person underneath, uncertain and afraid and trying desperately not to show it. "You don't have to. I'm the one who's trained for this. I can manage the transformation better than you. I have years of working with magic, of understanding what it means to channel power, of knowing how to protect myself from being consumed by forces larger than any individual can safely contain." Elaine shook her head, felt certainty settling into her bones, felt rightness in a way she'd never felt about anything, in her careful, obedient, small life. "You belong here. This is your home, your people, your purpose. I'm the one who was sent away, who learned to live in the gray world, who never quite fit in the convent, no matter how hard I tried to be what they needed. It makes sense that I be the one who bridges, who learns to walk between. Besides, what would I do hereafter? I don't know your ways. Don't share your certainties. Don't have your faith in the goddess or your understanding of the rituals. But I understand what it's like to not quite fit anywhere. Maybe that's what I was always meant for. Not destruction like our mother feared, just this. Being the doorway so others can pass through." The days blurred together in a haze of practice and preparation. of words repeated until they lived in Elaine's bones, of movements practiced until her body knew them better than her conscious mind, of breathing exercises that taught her how to open herself without losing herself, how to become permeable without dissolving entirely. The other priestesses watched from a distance, their faces carved with hope and fear and the particular sorrow of those who know they're witnessing the end of an era. The last gasp of something that's been dying slowly for generations and is finally, mercifully, or tragically depending on perspective, reaching its conclusion. Avalon was dying. They could all feel it. The mists grew thicker each day, less permeable, sealing the isle away from the world it was meant to serve, creating a barrier instead of a boundary, a wall instead of a veil. Magic was fading, withdrawing, growing dormant not because it was weak but because it had nowhere to go. No way to flow between the sacred and the mundane. No outlet into the world where it could touch lives and shape events and remind people that there was more to existence than what the church allowed them to see. Without the ritual, without the renewal, Avalon would become completely cut off within a year, would drift into the realm of pure spirit, unreachable by mortal means, as lost to the world as if it had never existed, as if all the priestesses who'd lived and died here, all the magic they'd worked, all the seekers they'd guided, all of it would become nothing more than legend, and eventually not even that, just vague stories about a magical isle that might never have been real at all. And when Avalon vanished, so too would the last anchor point for the old ways. The final proof that magic was real and present and accessible to those who knew how to look, to those who were willing to see past the church's insistence that anything beyond their narrow God was delusion or devilry. The weight of it pressed on Elaine as she practiced, as she learned, as she prepared to become something unprecedented, something that had never existed before because the ritual had never required quite this sacrifice, had never demanded quite this transformation. Previous generations had performed it differently, had found ways to sustain the magic without requiring anyone to become permanently threshold. But the world had changed. The boundaries had hardened. What used to work no longer sufficed. Now someone had to pay the price in their own flesh, in their own soul, in their own permanent transformation from human to something other. Beltane Eve arrived with the smell of apple blossoms thick in the air, cloying and sweet, mixed with wood smoke from fires being lit across the isle in preparation for the night's celebration and ritual. This was the night when the boundary between worlds grew thinnest, when spirits walked freely and magic pulsed like a heartbeat through everything that lived, when the normal rules bent and sometimes broke entirely, when anything was possible if you were brave enough or foolish enough to reach for it. This was the night when transformation was not just likely but inevitable. When the universe itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. What new thing would be born from the collision of will and power and desperate need? The priestesses gathered at the stone circle on the highest point of Avalon, their faces painted with symbols Elaine was only beginning to understand. Marks of power and protection, and petition to forces that predated humanity and would outlast it. Forces that cared nothing for human concerns but could sometimes be persuaded to act if the petition was made correctly. if the price was right, if the need was genuine, and the petitioners willing to pay whatever cost was demanded. Their voices lifted in songs that made Elaine's bones vibrate and her skin prickle with recognition. Harmonies that shouldn't work according to any musical theory she'd been taught, but that somehow created something larger than the sum of their parts, something that opened doors in the fabric of reality. That called attention from realms beyond mortal perception. That announced two powers watching that something significant was about to happen, and their presence was requested, required. Essential. Morwen stood at the center of the circle, wrapped in robes the color of deep forest, marked with signs of power that glowed faintly in the firelight, her face serene and terrible. Every inch the high priestess she'd been trained to be. Every gesture speaking of authority and confidence, and the kind of certainty that comes from years of practice, from knowing exactly who you are and what you're meant to do. Elaine stood at the edge where the mist began, where Avalon ended and the mortal world began, the threshold between worlds made physical. Dressed in simple white, as befitted an initiate, as befitted someone about to be unmade and remade into something new. Someone who was giving up everything familiar to become something unprecedented and necessary and terrifying. The ritual began as the moon cleared the horizon, full and bright and pulling at the tides of magic, the way it pulled at the ocean, the way it pulled at blood and bone, and the hidden waters that moved through all living things. Morwen's voice rose first, strong and certain, speaking the words that called power from deep within the earth, from the heart of Avalon itself, from the accumulated magic of centuries, from every priestess who'd ever walked these paths and poured her life into sustaining this place, from the bones buried beneath the soil, from the ancient trees that remembered when the world was young, from sources so deep and old that naming them was impossible, that human language couldn't capture their essence or their nature. Elaine felt it answer, felt magic surge upward through stone and soil, felt it gather around her sister like a storm about to break, like lightning looking for ground, like power that had been sleeping and was now very much awake and looking for direction, for purpose, for someone to shape it and give it form. Then it was her turn. She spoke the words Morwen had taught her, the words that had become part of her over 3 days of constant practice, and felt reality shift, felt the boundary between worlds grow thinner, felt herself becoming permeable, becoming doorway, becoming the space through which power could flow without destroying what it touched. The sensation was overwhelming. She was drowning and flying and being torn apart and woven back together all at once. Every cell in her body seemed to be vibrating at a different frequency, trying to exist in multiple states simultaneously, trying to be both solid matter and pure energy, both human flesh and spirit form, both individual and part of something vastly larger. She could see everything, past and future bleeding together, moments layered over each other like translucent silk. Possibilities branching out in every direction, choices made and unmade and remade in infinite variation. The mortal world and Avalon and realms beyond both layered over each other, occupying the same space but at different frequencies, different vibrational rates, different states of being. She saw her mother's choice, saw the vision that had terrified Vivian with perfect clarity now, as if it had been written in fire across the sky. Not that Elaine would destroy Avalon. That Elaine would choose it, would sacrifice herself for it. Would become this thing, this threshold creature, this permanent doorway between worlds, and leave Morwen alone with all the responsibility and none of the connection. Her mother had tried to prevent this exact moment, and in doing so had made it inevitable, had set in motion the very sequence of events she'd hoped to avoid, had fulfilled her own prophecy through the act of trying to escape it. The power flowed through her, and it hurt in ways she had no words for, in ways that transcended physical pain and entered realms of spiritual agony, of transformation so profound it felt like dying, except she didn't die, couldn't die, because the magic wouldn't let her. Needed her conscious and aware in choosing this, needed her will engaged and active rather than passive, needed her to be participant rather than victim, like being split open from the inside. Like every cell in her body dissolving and reforming, like death except consciousness persisted through it, watching, experiencing, unable to look away or retreat into unconsciousness or find any escape from the intensity of what was happening. She screamed, and the sound was swallowed by the roar of power moving between worlds, by the crash of magic flowing through a channel that had been closed for too long, by the sound of reality itself groaning under the strain of forces it wasn't designed to contain, forces that bent the rules of what was possible and sometimes broke them entirely. She felt something in her break and heal and break again, felt her ordinary human boundaries dissolve like mist under morning sun, felt herself expand until she was touching both worlds simultaneously, holding them together through sheer stubborn will and the power flowing through her from her sister and from Avalon itself, from sources she couldn't name but could feel, ancient and vast and utterly indifferent to her suffering, caring only that the work was done, that the connection was renewed, that magic could flow again. When it was over, she was lying on the ground with Morwen kneeling beside her, her sister's face wet with tears she didn't bother to hide, her hands gentle as they touched Elaine's face, checking for life, for consciousness, for any sign that her sister had survived the transformation intact. One of Elaine's eyes had changed color, turned gray to match Morwen's, as if the ritual had marked her physically, had branded her as someone who'd crossed a threshold most humans never even approached, who'd become something new and strange and necessary. "Are you alive?" Morwen's voice was shaking, stripped of its usual certainty, reduced to simple, desperate hope that her sister hadn't been destroyed by what they'd done. Elaine tried to answer, but words felt strange, too solid, too limited for what she needed to express. Inadequate containers for experiences that transcended language, that existed in spaces words couldn't reach. She could see everything now. The mists were transparent to her, no longer barrier but passage, no longer wall but invitation. She could see through them into the mortal world, could see Brigid's convent miles away, could see the abbess kneeling in prayer, could see every pathway between worlds lit up like threads of light just waiting for someone to follow them, waiting for someone who could walk both sides, who could be bridge and doorway and threshold all at once. Part 3. The threshold. I'm here. The words came out at last, rough and uncertain, as if Elaine had to remember how speech worked, as if language was a skill she'd temporarily forgotten and had to relearn. I'm different, but I'm here. The ritual worked. She was alive, but not as she had been. Was human, but not only human. Was Elaine, but also something else, something new. Something that had never existed before this moment. Something the world had needed without knowing it needed. Something that could hold the door open between worlds so magic didn't die and the old ways could survive at least a little longer. Morwen helped her sit up, and Elaine saw the other priestesses approaching. Saw wonder and gratitude and relief on their faces. Saw tears and smiles and the kind of joy that comes from being reprieved from certain doom. From discovering that the end they'd been dreading wasn't going to happen after all. That there was still time, still hope, still possibility. Avalon was saved. The mists would remain permeable. Magic would continue to flow between worlds, instead of being trapped on one side, slowly suffocating. The cost had been paid, and the old ways would survive at least another generation. Would have time to adapt and change and find new forms that could persist in a world increasingly hostile to mystery and magic. But at what price? Elaine looked at her hands and saw them as they were and as they could be. Saw the potential in every moment branching into infinite futures. Saw the weight of choice and consequence laid bare in ways that made simple decisions impossibly complex. That revealed how every small action rippled outward, affecting things she couldn't predict or control. That showed her the terrible responsibility of free will when you could see some of the consequences playing out before you even made the choice. She could never go back to the convent now. Could never pretend to be just another nun tending herbs and saying prayers. Could never unknow what she knew. Could never be satisfied with the small, safe life the church offered. Could never believe again in their certainties and absolutes, when she'd seen how much more complicated reality actually was. But she couldn't stay on Avalon either. She didn't belong here, had never belonged anywhere really, and now that was permanent, was written into her flesh and bones, and the way she perceived reality was fundamental to what she'd become. She would spend the rest of her life in between, neither one thing nor the other, holding the door open so others could pass through, being bridge and threshold and doorway, but never quite destination, never quite home. 6 months later, and Elaine had learned to navigate her new existence with something approaching grace. Had found rhythms and patterns that worked. Had discovered that being threshold wasn't curse but calling. Wasn't loss but transformation into something necessary and strange and utterly unique. She moved between Avalon and the mortal world with an ease that startled even more when, appearing and disappearing like smoke, like mist, like something that existed in the spaces between solid things. Never quite settling anywhere, never quite belonging, but also never quite alone. Always connected to both worlds, even when she was fully present in neither. She found seekers in the mortal world, those who dreamed of magic and mystery, those whose souls ached for something beyond the church's gray certainties. Those who woke in the night reaching for things they couldn't name and didn't understand but knew with absolute conviction were real and important and worth pursuing despite the danger, despite the church's condemnation, despite the risk of being named heretic or witch or worse. She brought them to Avalon, guided them through the mists that only she could navigate with such certainty. Led them by the hand through passages that would have been impassable to anyone else. that required someone who existed in both worlds simultaneously to find and follow. She brought them to drink from the old wisdom, to sit with the priestesses who remained, to learn what they needed to learn before returning to their ordinary lives, before going back to the gray world, carrying seeds of magic that might take root in unexpected places, that might grow into something the church couldn't suppress or destroy, that might ensure the old ways survived even if Avalon itself eventually faded. She became legends slowly, stories told in whispers about the woman who could walk between worlds, who served the goddess by being doorway rather than destination, who helped others find their way to mystery without demanding they stay there, who understood that for most people magic was meant to be encountered and then integrated into ordinary life rather than becoming their entire existence. She still wore the simple gray of her convent days, the rough homespun that marked her as someone who'd chosen simplicity over ostentation, who'd learned that power didn't need to announce itself with fine clothes or elaborate jewelry or any of the external markers people used to signal status and authority. But now she paired it with the priestess cloak that Morwen had made for her, embroidered with symbols that marked her as threshold, as liminal, as belonging to neither world fully and both partially, as someone who existed in the spaces between definitions, who couldn't be categorized or contained or reduced to simple explanation. The cloak was beautiful, dark green like deep forest, stitched with silver thread that caught the light and seemed to move even when she was standing still, that created patterns that shifted depending on which world you were looking from, that showed different things to mortal eyes and magical sight. She and Morwen saw each other rarely, perhaps once a month when Elaine returned to Avalon to rest and recover from the strain of holding the threshold open, from the constant awareness of both worlds that sometimes threatened to split her. Attention so thoroughly she forgot how to be present in either one completely. Their relationship was warm but distant, complicated by the fact that Elaine's choice had saved Avalon but left her fundamentally other, unable to participate fully in the daily life of the Isle, unable to take part in the rituals and celebrations and simple mundane tasks that bound the other priestesses together into something like family. She was always visitor now, never resident, always passing through rather than staying, always about to leave even when she'd just arrived. Morwen ruled as High Priestess with confidence and grace, having grown into her power without the shadow of their mother's expectations hanging over her, without the constant comparison to the sister who'd been sent away, without the burden of being the safe choice, the controllable one, the daughter who stayed because staying was what was required of her. She was good at it, better perhaps than Vivian had been, because Morwen understood that the world was changing and the old ways needed to adapt or die, needed to find new forms that could survive in a world increasingly hostile to anything that challenged the Church's authority, that questioned their claim to be the only path to the divine, that suggested mystery might be found outside their narrow definitions. She welcomed the seekers Elaine brought, incorporated new ideas, found ways to make ancient wisdom relevant to people whose lives looked nothing like the lives of those who'd first walked these paths, who lived in cities rather than villages, who worked with metal and trade rather than soil and season, who navigated social hierarchies and political intrigues rather than the simpler challenges of survival and harvest. She understood that magic needed to be living and growing, or it would become nothing more than museum piece, relic of a dead past, curiosity for scholars rather than vital force that shaped lives and opened possibilities. One evening, Elaine stood in the mists between worlds, balanced perfectly between Avalon and England, between magic and mundane, between who she'd been and who she'd become, between the convent girl who'd tended herbs and prayed and never questioned, and the threshold keeper who saw everything and belonged nowhere, and somehow found peace in that impossible position. She could hear Morwen's voice drifting from the stone circle where her sister led the Beltane celebration, the annual renewal that was easier now, that required less sacrifice because Elaine held the door open permanently, because magic could flow freely rather than building up pressure that needed to be released in dramatic ritual. She could hear the convent bells ringing vespers across the water, could imagine the nuns moving through their evening prayers, could picture the abbess kneeling in the chapel, wondering sometimes what had become of the quiet girl who'd been so good with herbs, who'd left one spring morning and never returned. She could hold both sounds simultaneously, without conflict or confusion, could exist in both worlds at once, without feeling torn or divided, could be completely herself in the space between, rather than trying to be what either side needed or expected. She smiled, tired but content, understanding at last what her mother had feared. What vision had driven Vivian to make the choice that had shaped both daughters, lived in ways she couldn't have predicted or controlled. Not that Elaine would destroy Avalon, that she would give herself to it so completely there would be nothing of the ordinary girl left, that she would become so thoroughly threshold that returning to simple human existence would be impossible, that she would choose magic and mystery over safety and belonging, and everything the convent represented. Vivian had tried to save her from this fate, and in doing so had made it inevitable, had set in motion exactly the sequence of events she'd hoped to prevent, had fulfilled her own prophecy through the act of trying to escape it. But perhaps that was always how prophecy worked, how seeing the future functioned. Perhaps knowing what was coming didn't mean you could change it, only that you could choose how you met it, with resistance that made it painful, or with acceptance that made it bearable, with fear that made you small, or with courage that let you grow into what you needed to become. The ninth wave, they called it in the old stories, the ancient tales that predated even Avalon, that came from times when humans were newer, and the world was stranger, and magic moved freely through everything that lived. The largest wave, the one that breaks with the most force, the one that crashes against the shore with violence that reshapes the land, that changes the coastline, that makes permanent what had been temporary, that transforms beach and rock and everything it touches. But after the ninth wave comes calm water, comes a chance to breathe, comes the space for something new to begin, comes the possibility of rebuilding differently, comes the opportunity to learn from what was destroyed and create something better. Elaine had been that wave, had crashed against the shore of her own life and been transformed in the breaking, had shattered into pieces and reformed into something new, had died to who she was and been reborn as who she needed to be, had paid the price that magic demanded and received in return a purpose larger than any she could have found in the safe, small life the convent offered. And in the calm that followed, in the space she'd created by choosing threshold over safety, by accepting transformation over stability, by becoming bridge instead of staying firmly planted on one side or the other, magic continued to breathe. The old ways survived. and two sisters who'd been separated by fear and prophecy, and their mother's desperate attempt to protect them both, had found their way back to something that wasn't quite love but was close enough, was real enough, was strong enough to sustain them both through the difficult work of maintaining balance in a world that wanted everything to be simple and clear and easily categorized. The mists swirled around her and Elaine stepped through them, moving toward a seeker who needed guidance, toward someone whose dreams had brought them to the edge of mystery, whose soul ached for magic even if they didn't have words for the longing, whose life was about to change in ways they couldn't predict but would ultimately find themselves grateful for even when the changes were difficult and the cost was high. She was the doorway now, the bridge, the space between, the threshold that stayed open so others could pass through without having to pay the price she'd paid, without having to transform as completely as she'd transformed, without having to give up belonging in exchange for purpose. And though it had cost her everything familiar, though she would never again know the simple comfort of belonging completely anywhere, though she would spend the rest of her life in the spaces between things, rather than firmly planted in any single place, she had found something better than comfort. She had found meaning. She had found purpose. She had found herself, and that self turned out to be larger and stranger and more necessary than the small frightened convent girl could ever have imagined possible. And sometimes, late at night, when the worlds were quiet and she stood balanced perfectly between them, when magic pulsed, gentle and steady like a heartbeat, when she could feel both Avalon and England and all the spaces between, she heard her mother's voice carried on the wind, not words exactly, but the sense of approval, of pride, of love that had been complicated and imperfect, and expressed in the worst possible way, but real nonetheless, real and powerful and enduring, despite everything. "Thank you," Elaine whispered into the mists, into the space between worlds, into the listening silence that held both everything and nothing. For everything, even the pain. Especially the pain, because pain had been the price of transformation, and transformation had been the only path to truth. And truth had revealed that she was never meant to be small, or safe, or contained within the church's narrow definitions of what women could be, what power looked like, what serving the divine actually meant. The mists carried her words away to wherever such things went, to whatever realm held prayers and wishes, and the desperate hopes of those who loved imperfectly but completely. And Elaine moved forward into her strange, liminal, perfect life, neither priestess nor nun, neither human nor spirit, but something new entirely, something necessary, something that would endure as long as there were seekers who needed doorways and magic, that needed channels and worlds that needed bridges between them. She had become the ninth wave, had broken against the shore of impossibility and proven that what seemed fixed could change, that what seemed permanent could transform, that what seemed like endings could actually be beginnings if you were brave enough to let go of what you thought you knew and accept what you were becoming. And in the calm water that followed, in the space cleared by her transformation, possibility bloomed. Magic survived. The old ways adapted. And a threshold keeper walked between worlds, holding the door open, being bridge and doorway and invitation, reminding everyone who glimpsed her that reality was larger and stranger and more beautiful than any single perspective could capture, that the spaces between things were as important as the things themselves, that sometimes the answer to impossible choices wasn't picking one side or the other, but finding a way to hold both simultaneously and becoming something new in the process. The story ends here, with a lane in the mists, with magic flowing, with two sisters finding peace in their separate but connected paths, with the old ways surviving because someone was brave enough to pay the price, wise enough to see that sacrifice could be gift, strong enough to hold the threshold open even when the cost was everything they'd known. The ninth wave had broken, the calm had come, and in that calm, in that space of breathing, of rest, of gentle magic flowing where it was needed, the world continued, changed but enduring, wounded but healing, smaller than it had been but not yet so small that wonder had vanished entirely. And that, in the end, was enough.